All right, Michael, thank you for joining me. Let's start by reviewing a little bit what we covered in the previous lesson. So last time I gave examples of two distinct kinds of changes. One kind called accidental change, and I gave the example of, me becoming sunburned, or the lump of clay becoming a statue, being shaped by the artist into a statue, or the tortoise moving from the start line to the finishing line. And the common thread here is that in all these kinds of changes, we have a subject that remains. The other kind of substantial change, which will be the topic of today's lesson, is called, the other kind of change is called substantial change. And that's the kind of change where a subject no longer is. For example, the armadillo dies, and what we're left with is a carcass. Or the water from the fountain becomes part of me, right? So in a sense, the water no longer is what it used to be, and it becomes part of me. Or the seed is fertilized, and we have a new kind of being. Okay, so that's called substantial change. So last time we went over accidental change, and we highlighted the principles of accidental change is that we need a subject that persists through the change, right? And then we need the acquisition of a new form, right? And therefore, we have to make sure that at the beginning of the change, the form in question is not present, and it is acquired by the subject at the end of the change. So, for example, if in the accidental change of me getting sunburned, me, the subject, persists through the change, but we start off with the accidental form of being pale-skinned. At the beginning, I am pale-skinned. And at the end of the change, I am red-skinned, right? I'm sunburnt, right? So the accidental form of being red-skinned is not present at the beginning. There's what we call, philosophically, the privation. It's a little bit of hair splitting, if you will, but the scholastics love to split hair about anything. But here, so they make sure that you need to have the privation, because if the accidental form is present at the beginning of the change, then you don't really have a change. So the accidental form is not present at the beginning. And we know it's not present because at the beginning, I have another accidental form in the same respect. I'm pale-skinned. And then I become red-skinned, okay? Same thing here. The tortoise, persists through the change, but we start off with the accidental form of being at the start line. That's the accidental form of location. And then at the end of the change, it's being at the finish line. And so those were, the two examples I had. The third example was the statue being shaped. So it's a change of shape. There's the acquisition of the shape. Before I move forward to talking about substantial change, I want to make sure that I want to clarify the use of the term in philosophy, the use of the term accidents and substances, which is quite specific and quite different from the way nowadays we use the terms accident and substance. Nowadays, if you talk about an accident, you say something happened, it's something random, usually something unfortunate. You walked across the street, you got hit by a motorcycle, that's an accident, And then when we talk nowadays about substance, that connotes something also, or even denotes something completely different, where a substance would be some kind of stuff, usually a chemical stuff, usually some kind of homogeneous chemical stuff, like the dough in the that I'm going to make into a pizza. The dough is a substance, or water is a substance, or salt water is a substance. So it kind of connotes some kind of homogeneous chemical thing about which we're going to say this chemical has certain properties and whatnot. I mean, I think that's most of the way we use the term substance. We also use the term substantial nowadays to mean important, right? If this is something substantial, it means it's really important. Well, we're not going to use the way we use accidental and substantial in the philosophy of nature is distinct from all these meanings that I've just highlighted. And really, the meaning of accident and substance These are terms that were, or concepts that were coined by Aristotle in his book called the Categories. That's one of the logical treatises of Aristotle. The book of Categories is a very important philosophical book in which he essentially reflects on predication. Category really means predication. Category is the Greek equivalent for the term predication. And in syntax or in logic, the predicate, if you have a grammatical sentence like A is B, A is the subject and B is the predicate, right? So for example, I have a series of propositions here listed. Fido is a dog, so Fido is the subject, a dog is the predicate. Fido is brown, Fido is the subject, brown is the predicate. Fido is in the yard, so Fido is the subject, in the yard is the predicate. Man is an animal, red is a color. Okay, so all these are sort of logical constructions, propositions, very simple propositions, with a subject, a copula, is, the word is, and a predicate. And the predicate is supposed to be specifying something about the subject. So in the book of Categories, Aristotle reflected on the fact that these predicates can be classified in two kinds: accidents or substances. And accidents are beings which by nature inhere in another being. Okay? So an accident, it's a being that inheres in another being. And the examples that I gave last time would be, being red, right? So being red, this particular red is an accident, because red is never by itself. There's no redness floating around, right? Red is always inheres in some kind of subject, whether it's the red ball or the red skin of my face or the red flower. Red is always in a subject, right? But there are other beings that, never inhere in other beings. And those Aristotle called substances. For example, me as a subject, if you consider me as, I'm a substance because I'm a bearer of accident. The accidents inhere in me, but you cannot say of me that I am in any other being, or I cannot say of you that you are in any other being, or I cannot say of this dog that this dog is in any other being. So let me give you examples of particular substance to drive that point. Michel Accad, me, I'm a substance. Michael Acri, you are a substance. Fido the dog is a substance. The cypress tree at the entrance of the San Francisco Arboretum is a substance, because none of these beings inhere or can be said to inhere or to be present in another being. Okay? The bar of gold in the vault at the bank is a substance. The body of water over there is a substance. So you can see that the word substance here that we use, it has a very different connotation from the modern meaning of the word substance, which is primarily related to its sort of chemical distinction. When you say nowadays, if you talk about a substance, you usually talk about a chemical substance. In philosophy, the word substance is used precisely as an opposite, as a distinction from accidents. And substances are bearers of accidents. The accidents inhere in substances, and substances are never inherent in any other being. Okay, substances are distinct beings that are beings in a way that are in themselves. Okay, that subsist and have their own principle of being. Okay, and we'll get back to that. I mean, there'll be a point that we'll get back to later on in the in the next few lessons. But I want to bring that up so that we're not confused about the use of the term substances and accidents and accidental change and substantial change. Okay, So to go back to the question of substantial change here I have the example of a tree, which is a substance, because in a tree is a bearer of accident. You can say that the tree is green, or the tree is located here, or the tree is tall, or it has all these it bears all these accidents. And so imagine the tree being hit by lightning and being reduced to a pile of ashes. Okay, so once we have the pile of ashes, the tree no longer is. Okay, it's been essentially annihilated, or whatever you want, however you want to describe that change. But the tree no longer is, and therefore we don't have a subject that persists through this change. But at the same time, we sense a continuity. Okay, it's not that the tree has vanished out of existence and out of thin air the ash has materialized. We do sense a continuity from the tree to the ash, to the pile of ashes, and therefore we consider this as a change. Okay, a change, and therefore it needs its explanatory principles, to explain the change. And as we recall from a couple of lessons ago, we need a principle to account for the continuity, and we need a principle to account for the newness. Okay. Again, to distinguish accidental versus substantial change, in accidental change, one example would be the tree being green to becoming yellow, or green leaf to becoming yellow leaf. That would be an accidental change. But this is a substantial change. We have the tree no longer being there, and we have the ashes being there instead. That's a substantial change. Okay, so we have a change from one substance to another substance. Okay, because the ashes, again, let's, setting aside whether it's one thing or a conglomeration of things, let's for the time being keep it simple and imagine that the ashes are just one substance, one thing. The ashes itself is a bearer of accidents. The ashes are here. They happen to be gray. They have the color gray. They can be cold ashes. They can be hot ashes. So the ashes has some kind of substantial reality here. Okay, which is different from the substantial reality of the tree. Okay, so there's a change of substances from one substance to the next, and if there's a change, okay, there must be a principle of potency that accounts for the continuity in the change. Okay, there must be a principle that explains why that continuity, and that principle of continuity we're going to call here prime matter. We cannot call it the subject as we did when we talked about accidental change, because in accidental change the subject was clearly remained. I mean, there was a tree, for example, that was green before, that was yellow after. Here there's the subject is no longer the same, and therefore the principle of potency cannot be the subject. We're going to call this principle of potency that accounts for the continuity and the change, we're going to call that principle prime matter. Okay? And there must also be a principle of act that accounts for the change to a new substance. Okay? And that principle of act we're going to call the substantial form. In distinction, distinguishing that from the various accidental forms that I gave examples of before. Okay? So the change here, if we go back to the same sort of scheme of change that we had highlighted for accidental change, we're going to have something that persists through the change, and that is prime matter. And we're going to have something that goes from a privation to an acquisition. And what's acquired in this change is the substantial form of ash is acquired at the end of the change. Okay? That was not present at the beginning, because at the beginning we didn't have ashes, we had a tree. Okay? So the substantial form of tree was present, and that is no longer there at the end of the change, but instead we have the acquisition of the substantial form of ash or ashes. Okay? So just to highlight again, it follows the same scenario, the same pattern as we had highlighted before. There's a terminus from and a terminus to which, right? Prime matter persisting, privation of the substantial form at the beginning, acquisition of the substantial form at the end of substantial change. Okay. Obviously, all I'm doing here in this lesson, I'm just introducing these terms and these concepts, and then in subsequent lessons, we will try to elaborate on that and get a better appreciation for what all that means, because it all matters at the end of the day. It's not just putting labels on things, but that's all I'm doing here. Okay, so matter and form as principles of change, right? So to summarize what we've covered so far, both with accidental change and substantial change, by reflecting on the intelligibility of change, we have deduced the existence of the first principles of change, because we have to account in change, we have to account for the continuity, and we have to account for the newness. Okay, and we said that Aristotle, in order to solve that problem, to get out of the dilemma between, on the one hand, Heraclitus' position that says nothing is, everything is just a succession of change and nothing is, or the Parmenidean position that says change is an illusion, and everything is just one. Aristotle introduced the question of being in potency and being in act. And he said that the being in potency is what allows us to account for the continuity in a change. Okay, and the being in act is what accounts for the newness. Okay, and we use the term matter to refer to the principle of potency, and we use the term form to refer to the principle of act. Okay, and here I'm going to introduce one more term, which is hylomorphism, because this question of potency and act is really the major insight, Aristotelian insight. Okay, matter and form, and hylo is Greek for matter, and morphe is Greek for form, and therefore this Aristotelian philosophy that we're going to be exploring over the next however many lessons can be referred to as hylomorphism. Okay, it's the theory of nature that establishes that there are two fundamental principles of being: potency and act, or matter and form, and therefore that combination of these two principles of being is called hylomorphism, or the theory that acknowledges the reality of being in potency and the reality of being in act is called hylomorphism. So I wanted to introduce this term here, and I think that's the end for this lesson. And in the next lesson, before we start digging deeper into the concept of matter first, and then later on digging deeper into the concept of form, in the next lesson, I'm going to review a little bit what we've done so far, but I'm going to show you another way by which we arrive at this dual concept of matter and form that is independent of the question of change. Okay? So hang on to your hat. And do you have any questions here, or any comments, or do you have any remarks? And I understand that a lot of this is very new and needs to be digested, and you're probably in a holding position trying to see where that is going, but
I do have one comment or question at this point.
Yeah.
And that is the degree to which Aristotle is trapped or confused by accidental features of language. Not every language has a copula. In Greenlandic, for example, there is no way to say the grass is green. We can only say the grass greens. Mm-hmm. So it's a more Heraclitean kind of language. I'm trying to think what Aristotle's philosophy would have looked like had he spoken Greenlandic instead of Greek.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm not familiar with Greenlandic. I'm familiar with Arabic. Arabic also doesn't have the word to be, or the verb form to be. And I suspect that's been, I don't know the answer to your question. Okay. I suspect it's been addressed. And perhaps one way is that, the language is a little bit, so you're right. I mean, it's a good question. I don't have an answer to that. And I don't know that I will actually address it in the course of I might research it at some point and get back to you and say, hey, by the way, people have reflected on this, and this is, what they say. But if we don't have the word to be, right, and if there's no copula in certain sentences, in certain cultures, to what extent does that bear on the reality of things? Again, at the same time, we hold that Greenlanders and Americans are going to be able to, that there's a reality out there that is outside of our minds. Okay, so we are realists. That's one of our assumptions. So in a way, we are basing our philosophy on a certain assumption that the reality out there is outside of our mind, and therefore it has its operative principles that are not mind dependent. And therefore, there must be a way of bridging that distinction between the way we use language to express what is out there in reality. Okay. It's a good question. I think it's very intriguing. I just haven't had a chance to explore it. And it's important. So is Aristotle getting confused? Go ahead. I'm going to,
Well, just pursuing that
Right.
thought
Right.
one step farther, the first possible response from Aristotle might be that greens is a predicate just as much as is green. But if Aristotle were a native Greenlandic speaker, it seems to me less likely that he would have been inclined to identify green as a separate being.
Right. Yeah, that's right. That's very possible. And actually, I'm not sure how the Greek language itself is. Does it? I suspect it must have the copula in its
I assume so,
syntax.
but I don't know Greek
Right.
either.
I don't know.
Yeah, it seems like it must have had for Aristotle to come up with this
Right.
philosophy.
Right.
So it seems like there may be a kind of reification of language here into a metaphysics.
It's very hard to tease out the two. You're right, and I can't. I'm not familiar enough with linguistics and the relationship between linguistics and metaphysics, but they do. So, in a way, you're correct that even it's impossible to consider his book on the categories as simply a logical book without seeing in it certain metaphysical as not only just having metaphysical implications, but actually having metaphysical assumptions. But at this point, again, I'm going to ask you to be patient with me. First of all, it's not really my, I don't have the answers, and so I'm going to ask you to just set it aside. I think it's quite an important observation, but it's an observation that perhaps we can rehash once we've covered. At least my intention here is to cover the basics.
Okay.
And there are many things that I'm saying here that are subject to not criticism, but questioning. That can be questioned, and we can go deeper and deeper. But at this point, I really want to give just a survey of the basics, and then bring on the challenges, and proceed in that way.
Okay.
I thought you were going to say that the fact that there's a copula allows him to make a distinction between accidents and substances, accidental change and substantial change. Were you saying that, or you were not making that point?
I hadn't gone that far. I don't know.
Because I'm not sure that it does. I mean, if you don't have the copula, it could see, and you could deny the distinction between substances and accidents, and people do. And I mean, there are modern ways of modern philosophies. And even we will go into this when we talk about mechanism. Explaining change via the philosophy of mechanism, or mechanicism, if you will. So mechanicism in a way denies the distinction between substances and accidents. And for mechanicism, everything would be accidental change.
Well, I'm thinking about the distinction you drew in terms of inherence, that
Right.
Substantive qualities don't inhere, but accidental qualities do.
Right. Although I wouldn't say substantive qualities, I would say substances don't inhere. A substance is a being. It's not because it's a substance. It's not a quality. A quality, by definition, is an accident.
I see. Okay.
Okay. So a quality is an accident, and he goes in the book of categories. He has his own classifications. So you have substances, and then you have 9 different. He comes up with 9 different types of categories: qualities, location, relationship, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't want to get into this, although it's very interesting, and at some point we become pertinent, and maybe we can explore that a little bit. But an accident, so a quality is a kind of accident, because a quality always inheres in whatever bears that quality.
Right. Got it.
Okay.
Okay.
So yeah.
But if we don't detach the quality in the first place through a copula as a separate kind of being, which would not be natural in a language without a copula, then I wonder what happens to the distinction between substance and accident.
Right.
So I think that may be a fair question to draw.
Correct. It may be, and I don't have the answer to that. Anything else, or
that'll do it for now, I think.
Okay. All right. See you at the next lesson.